Hey, everybody, and welcome to episode number 35 of Boutique Talk. My name is Jake Boston, otherwise known as Steelbook Obsessed on all your major social media platforms. And if you want to listen to all things physical media related, then you've come to the right place. Every week, I have on a new guest to talk about their physical media journey. And tonight, my guest has been capturing interviews, recording commentaries, and creating documentaries for well over a decade. And his work has been cemented on boutique label releases from Scream Factory, Paramount Presents, Shout Select, Vinegar Syndrome, and TerraVision, just to name a few. You can catch some of his work on the upcoming releases of When Titans Ruled the Earth from Arrow Video and the Paramount Presents 4K release of Bringing Out the Dead. It's truly a pleasure to introduce Justin Beahm onto the podcast. Justin, how is it going?
Oh, it's great, man. Thanks so much for having me on. This is going to be fun.
Absolutely, yeah. My favorite thing about collecting physical media is watching all the special features afterwards. It just kind of engrosses me in that world as much as I possibly can.
Yeah.
So actually having somebody that's created the special features, I am very excited to talk your ear off for a while.
Oh, happy to be here. Happy to be here. And yeah, that's kind of, it's more than the icing on the cake at this point. I think it's really, especially in the market today, it's a huge drive for people to pick something up in the first place. So I think they're more vital than ever, especially for physical releases. Yeah.
Yes. And the one that I have for the background, you can kind of see it in this, that Bringing Out the Dead. Like,
yeah,
when that got announced, I was hyped. And then I saw how many new special features are loaded in that sucker. Day one purchase for me. I cannot wait to see what is crafted on this thing.
Yeah, I had no breaks on that, and I was thrilled to not have breaks. It was like Bob and Doug McKenzie in Strange Brew when they're heading down that hill, and I was straight off the pier and into the water, happily drinking a few underneath as I sank in the depths of the world of Bringing Out the Dead, because it was a long time in the coming. It was one of those titles that I always said that I wanted to be a part of, that I had hoped to be a part of, and when it finally came to fruition, I was over the moon, and I still am.
So for all of the different studios that you do work for, when you guys have conversations, do you just have like a wish list of stuff that if you ever get this, this, and this, call me up. I would love to work on it.
Kind of. It's more I mean, there have been some that I've taken to different distributors. So especially Shout Factory, I took them, Sleepaway Camp and Carpenter's Body Bags, and I don't know, there were a couple other ones there too. Oh, I took Haunt to Ronin Flicks.
Nice.
So there, but usually it's the case that a studio or distributor has a title and they contact me and say, hey, we're doing, or a list, and they say, here's the list, which ones do you want? Or we got this title, we really want you on this one. That's happened too. So usually it comes from within, and then they sort of pitch it my way about if I want to be involved.
Sure. I kind of want to hear how you first got started in the industry. Just side quick note here. You're from Iowa. You grew up in Iowa. I grew up in Iowa. I still live in Iowa. I don't know how anybody like gets any opportunities out here. So I'm kind of curious how you kind of migrated to the coast and kind of made this happen for yourself.
Well, I'm still in Iowa, so this is still my base for sure. I'm out in Los Angeles a lot, every month or so, a month and a half, I'm out there. I do some other traveling out east depending on the project, but this is still very much my base. I've lived elsewhere, but really love life here, and especially raising, kids here. It's a great place to have kids, and
Agreed.
so that's really why I'm cemented in this area. But in the beginning, there was never a plan for this, because I think, like so many, the idea of being involved with film in any way felt like it was in a different universe. There was this huge moat between this kid sitting and just renting copious amounts of videotapes every weekend with his friends and his brother.
Yep.
And what I was reading about in like Fangoria or Famous Monsters or whatever. And it was a very roundabout way that I ended up getting involved, because I had always been a writer, and I worked for a weekly newspaper in Central Illinois for a number of years. And I had always been engaged in writing in different ways over the years, which led me, well, I ended up, this is a crazy story, but I saw an ad in the paper for a film that was being shot in West Branch, Iowa. And it was this zombie movie. They were looking for extras for it. And I had never been a part of anything like that. And I was like, well, what the hell? I might as well. And I showed up, and then next thing you know, I'm a zombie extra in this film called Collapse, which I think and it was eventually released as Collapse of the Living Dead. And I think it was out under a couple different titles too. But Anyway, on that set, in a role, sort of a small role, was Linnea Quigley, and I was
Ooh,
a huge fan of Linnea. She's another Iowa person, by the way. She's from Davenport,
I
and
did not know that. Okay.
and and we hit it off for, we're both vegan, vegetarian, and from there it was just kind of hitting it off real quickly. And I thought, well, maybe I could do an article, some interview with her. At that point, I really wanted to be in the pages of Fangoria. That was my ultimate goal. Doesn't matter if it was one article, I would have been so happy just to be in there once. And so I decided to do an interview with her on Night of the Demons. And then that led to me interviewing the director, Kevin Tenney, and that led to everybody in the cast. And that led to part 2 and then to part 3. And it was nuts because I just talk about not having breaks. I literally
Hmm.
didn't have any on this thing. I didn't have anywhere for it to go necessarily, but eventually I caught wind that Chris Alexander, who's our longtime writer for a bunch of different magazines, was going to step in as Fango editor. And so I wrote to Chris saying, "Hey, I understand you're on your way in. I've always wanted to write for the magazine. Can I send you a pitch? Can I send you a sample?" And I sent him the big Night of the Demons bloated thing that was far too big to hit print, and it still hasn't anywhere. But he's like, "Yeah, great. What else have you got?" And I made up this list of articles that I really hadn't written, but that I wanted to write. That would be great. And he said, "I'll take them all." And so then I was off into the deep end of writing. Well, fast forward a couple years, and I was writing or I was doing an article on the Halloween 4 through 6 story arc. And I interviewed Malik Akkad, who was Mustafa Akkad's son
Yeah.
and the head of the Trancas International and Compass International Films. And Malik and I, again, hit it off really well. And things went really quickly in the friendship. And then next thing you know, I'm working for Trancas. And then he and I co founded a nonprofit together. And it was during that window of time that we did Blu-rays on Halloween 4 and 5 for the first time, because they had just existed on a lot of DVDs from Anchor.
Mhm.
Just kept these two, they kept hammering over and over again, but
Right.
they had never made it to Blu-ray. And so for that, I got them to bite on doing a new special feature on each, which was a commentary with Dwight Little, the director, on 4, and then Don Shanks, who played Michael Myers on 5. And that ended up catching the attention of Jeff Nelson and Cliff McMillan at Shout Factory, who bumped into me at a convention I was part of soon thereafter. And they asked if I would be interested in doing some special features for Shout.
Hmm.
And then it was off to the races from there. And then that's grown into all these other companies and stuff. So really it was Fangoria. It was being a zombie extra in Collapse, and then
Right.
Fango, and then Trancas, and then Shout Factory. And that's how it all began.
But you're always still kind of following your interests, which is what you kind of need to do if you want to get your foot in the door anywhere. Just say, hey, I would love to be a part of this in any way, in shape or form, and then just kind of networking your way through and just kind of see what happens. It's very, very cool. I think you were part of that Paramount Scares box set too, if I'm not mistaken. Did you help write some of the Fangoria in that issue, since you did have some background?
Yeah, that was a really tremendous release last October from Paramount. Yeah, I was the guest editor on the issue of Fangoria that's in there. There's an exclusive standalone issue that has some classic articles and some new ones on the films that were part of this box set. And it's a really beautiful box. And that was a talk about coming around full circle kind of moment for all this to have begun with Fango. And then just last year to have had the opportunity to be guest editor on that issue is so wild.
That's
so
very,
wild.
very cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess I have a bunch of your releases here that you've done work on. I
Mhm.
kind of just want to flip some over and kind of get your 2 cents on like how the experience went, or anything you
Sure.
have to kind of add to it.
Yeah.
The first one, again, kind of on this Paramount Presents release line. As soon as Red Eye was announced, I lost it. I love this movie. I don't think it gets enough love. So for it to
Yeah.
get a 4K, I was through the moon.
Yeah. And that was a real special release because Wes Craven, that's one of his later films, of course.
Yeah.
And you're right. It is one that doesn't get a lot of attention out there, but it has an incredible cast. And the tension that he builds on that plane is just incredible. I mean, the
Yes.
intensity of that movie, and then everything that's happening on the shore too, with her dad in that hotel. I mean,
Hmm.
it's a lot of things that people don't expect from Wes Craven necessarily. So that was a real thrill to be a part of. And I brought a historian in for that to speak to a guy who had done a biography working with Wes
Hmm.
years ago, John Woolley, I think his name was. And he was a good contributor. And then a couple other pieces, including, this was a great example of the Paramount Archive team, they're like my heroes in all of this, because anytime I've gone to them with any kind of idea or just curious, hey, is this there? Do
Hmm.
we have anything like this? Like a director will mention something about an alternate intro for a movie or something, and I'll go, and they've found, just about every time they found something. And in this case, they found an archival interview with Wes that had never been used anywhere. So it was
Hmm.
kind of like a EPK type thing
Yeah.
on Red Eye. And so I was like, well, let's put Wes's voice on this. And that was the whole impetus for that. So that's the piece on that one that I'm probably the most excited about, was that we got a chance to unearth something previously unseen and unheard from him. That
Right.
was exciting to be a part of.
It always makes me curious what is hiding in those archives, like in their vault somewhere. They
Yeah.
just got to have so many treasures that they don't even know that they're sitting on. You just got to kind of
Yeah.
dig deep enough.
And they love it. I mean, that's
Yeah.
why they're there. That's why they work in that division. They're archivists, but they're also they're out there excavating. They're
Right.
combing the deep recesses for stuff, and they get so excited when they find something that no one knew was there, which again has happened a bunch of times. Like, that would be such a cool job, to work in the
Right.
archive at one of these big studios. That'd be so
Hmm.
fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go tell us what we have, please. That'd
Yeah.
be great. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh man. Well, I mean, kind of like the archival aspect is what I love about collecting physical media, because there are
Mhm.
like the big major releases that of course you have and you have some background on. But it's kind of like going through the movie stores back in the day, just buying something strictly off of like art alone, or reading the
Yeah.
synopsis and like, I think I might like this, or just going into a director's filmography and like, I gotta watch this if I like everything else that he's done.
Right.
I always like that kind of stuff. Is there have there been any projects that you've been asked to take part of that you have kind of fallen in love with that you really didn't have any recollection of?
Yeah, there have been a number of them. The Golden Child is one that had kind of escaped me when it came out. That was
Hmm.
another one for Paramount. That was a very early one when I was on board with them. But I was a huge Big Trouble, remain a huge Big Trouble in Little China fan, and
Yeah.
they were made at the same time, I came to find out, and there was a lot of parallels between them in terms of some cast members and some production approach and stuff. So,
Hmm.
but when I got hired for that one, they didn't really want to do anything new. That was a great example of it being all archive. And it was a bunch of interviews that were shot on set but never touched.
Hmm.
And so Golden Child is one that's nothing new on it, but it's new to the world because it had just been sitting in archive for so long. And I really came to love that movie through these interviews, which is such a cool, unique perspective,
Right.
because so many of the interviews I do now are people who may be out of the business or retired or on the other side. You know how that goes. And
Yeah.
here we're seeing Eddie Murphy in his prime. We're seeing, I mean, everybody who was a part of it was pretty young and really invigorated. The effects and set decoration team and the production designers and everything, everybody was so on fire about this inventive, wild project. But Eddie Murphy was the gem in that, because
Hmm.
during his interview, he's very soft spoken, and they're asking him at one point about, and I couldn't even include this in the final piece because it just didn't fit right. But they're asking him, what's next for you? Because he was known as a comic at that time, of course. And he said, oh, they asked him if he was going to do a stand-up film. And he said, no one should ever do a straight stand-up picture again. There's only one stand-up special that should ever stand, and that I don't want to touch that.
Hmm.
But I have this idea for a movie that has stand up mixed with some segments, like some interstitials. He didn't use the term interstitial, but he's like, and some other little bits in between. And what he was talking about were the seeds of what became Raw, which is like the biggest stand up comedy special of all
Hmm.
time, and it ran theatrically, tremendous hit, just got re-released, or is coming soon again, I think, again from Paramount on 4K, I believe. But here you're seeing this guy in this moment when he was so young, just sort of spitballing about this idea for what would transform the world of comedy shortly
Yeah.
thereafter, which was really cool. So that's a long story on that one, but
Oh no, it's
that
fine.
that was definitely one. Event Horizon was one that had escaped me when it first came out.
Me too.
I kind of missed that boat, but man, was it cool to dive in on that. And in a way, yeah, there it is.
Mm-hmm.
And to meet that film, to sort of be introduced to it as I'm gathering all these stories is a really cool angle because it offers insight from the get-go. And then I can watch it with a wider perspective in a way. It's almost like watching the special features first. And so that was another one. That's two of them. I know there have been many more,
Sure.
especially for some of the smaller labels, like movies I had never heard of before,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a couple.
One of the ones from me, I had a Brad on the podcast from TerraVision,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't have a lot of their stuff in my collection, so I grabbed a couple of things. And one of the things that I did grab was Video Violence 1
Yeah.
and 2. I didn't know what to expect going into this. It just has amazing cover art all over it. Like
Yep.
the main picture of like the bloody hand putting a VHS tape in it is just
Yeah.
spectacular.
Yeah.
And I'm not usually a big like shot on video guy, but the story of this was really captivating. I enjoyed the first one quite a bit, and I can't wait to get to the second one.
Oh, the second one might surprise. I don't know if you're
Oh
still going
yeah,
to be as in love, but the first one is a hell of a lot of fun. And what I love most about that, and I'd be curious if this was something that you attached yourself to, was that it's set in a video store and they shot
Mhm.
it in a video store.
Yes,
So it's not some stage thing with a couple racks of tapes behind a counter and some anonymous like empty storefront. It's really an actual video store and it has all the vibes, the return slot. They're checking
Mhm.
tapes in the morning.
All the promotional stuff from back in the day,
Yeah.
just hanging up. It's great.
Yeah. And it's real movies. So they come
Mhm.
up with, I think, Chainsaw Massacre or something at some point. And uh, that movie is so much fun. And I hadn't seen that for many, many years.
Yeah.
And it remains my favorite shot on video film just because of that element of the video store. It's just so richly nostalgic for me.
The way that this movie kind of captures the era, that's what kind of like archival special features kind of do too, because you're getting the actors, everybody involved, you're getting their raw emotions while they're making the project.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a little different when you kind of go back to them years later to reminisce, if you will.
Right.
How does the process go to kind of get back with these people and try to ask them if they want to talk about a project that they haven't thought about in a while?
I start with that wish list that you mentioned earlier.
Mhm.
And usually I don't have much of anything prescribed by anyone. There have been some occasions where they're like, we'd really like to get the writer on this because the ending was changed or I don't know, whatever. But usually I just start working off my wish list and they will have assigned me a budget and a due date. And so off of that, I can know, okay, I have about this much time and I can figure out how many I can fit in terms of interviews and things. And then I start working through that wish list and I try to reach out to people directly if I can. As you
Mhm.
can imagine, it's a lot easier than going through agents and managers and stuff
Right.
like that.
Yep.
But it's not always possible. So I do probably more than half the time end up going through some sort of publicist or something like that. And I just reach out and the outreach, if there's people out there looking to get into doing interviewing, whether for documentary or print or podcast or whatever it might be, I would just recommend on that initial outreach, keep it short, professional, avoid gushing and fan, sort of display
Mhm.
and speak directly to the point of what is to be expected and when it needs to be done by. So it's not that it's a complete boilerplate email that I send, but usually it's very close each email to whoever I'm sending it to. And if it's someone I've worked with before, of course, I'm going to personalize it and talk about our last project a little bit just
Sure.
to remind them of who I am.
Mhm.
But, and then there are many times too where I just have to call. I don't have an email and I have to make a cold call, which I've done, which is about 70% of the time that goes pretty well.
Mhm.
There's been a couple where they're like, I don't even know how you got my number and I don't want to talk about this and click. And that was on a lot of stuff, especially with like some of the more VHS type
Mhm.
releases where people are like,
Who really aren't famous. Yeah. Mhm.
yeah. And they're like, I made that with friends on a weekend once.
Yeah.
I have no stories to tell, so I'm sorry. But once I find, I mean, I really appreciate if I have the opportunity to get them on the phone and have a discussion about what the project is and how I want to approach it, that I can put a lot of concern to rest,
Sure.
because I they're talking to the person who will be interviewing them most of the time, me, and then also I can answer any question they have about how it's being handled, about the general approach, and I also make a point to reassure them that I'm never going after like the red meat. I'm never like what's the dirt on the people in this production. That's not
Yeah.
why I'm there. I'm
Hmm.
there for historical preservation, and I just want to capture that story. So that's how it begins, is usually an email, then a phone call, and then from there, the shoot.
So I guess when you do all the cold calls and you're working on a certain project, when does the kind of process happen to where if you have a whole bunch of interviews, you start the thought process of maybe making those interviews into a documentary? I know you've made a few of those in your time, because a lot of these bonus features, they are just like the interviews with the people. But one of my favorite things is to get a bonus movie with my movie, just to have like a nice edited piece of content about the making of a
Yeah.
project. How does that process go? Is it? I'm assuming it's all fluid, but I guess any information would be great.
Yeah, well, that's actually a big shift that happened pretty soon after I got into this, because in the beginning, my first releases, um, like Sleepaway Camp, for
Hmm.
example, that was an all-in documentary with a bunch of different interviews.
Yep.
Body Bags was the same. Other ones I've done like that are Eight-Legged Freaks, which I did during COVID, which is a real challenge for Shout Factory.
I think you did one for Silent Night, Deadly Night
Silent
too.
Night, Deadly Night 1 and 2 were like
Mhm.
probably my favorite two to do, especially part 2.
Sure.
That was one of my most treasured experiences in this whole journey.
Mhm.
But what happened was the distributors started asking for individual pieces.
Hmm.
So it looks like it's more content on the back of the cover,
I
because
see.
you get a big list
More
instead
bullet
of
points.
just,
Yeah.
yeah, instead of just a title with a bunch of names in parentheses or
Mm.
whatever. And then also, so anyway, it was a little heartbreaking for me initially, because I love assembling films. I love
Sure.
assembling full-fledged documentaries and film,
Hmm.
because I've really come to love editing too. And in the beginning, I was working with different editors who were friends of mine, and it just got to be way too much and too many things in too many places. And so I started doing it myself, and I absolutely love cutting most of the time, unless it's stacked too deep with too many deadlines simultaneously.
Right.
But but then what I found was, where were we going with that? I completely slipped my train of thought.
Going
Oh, the
cutting
documentary
process,
wrap. Yeah,
documentary versus interview.
right. So what happened was I came to embrace it when I started doing 2, 3 releases this way, because I realized that I was having the opportunity to have a richer, deeper, and more expansive conversation with each person.
Hmm.
And I think that I've really embraced it since then, because usually in these making ofs, you see a little bit of everybody.
Sure.
But in these individual interviews, you're seeing a lot of everybody. And especially early on, when I didn't, like on Big Trouble, for example, those interviews are so long.
Hmm.
And it was because I just felt so grateful to have these people in the chair. Many of them had not been interviewed for many releases like this before, if any. And it was like I just wanted to capture their whole thing and present it all in one. I don't go that far anymore, because I started getting complaints about how long stuff was,
Mm.
but it's still very much a more detailed discussion and presentation on each person when I do each of these. So to answer your question in an extremely long-winded way, it's not my decision. It's the distributor or studio that's sort of saying, we need individual pieces on this, or we want to do a full-fledged documentary.
Sure. I'm assuming a budget has to do with that too. It just takes more of your time to kind of edit, craft something together.
Actually, it's the opposite. I mean, it
Hmm.
takes longer for me to craft 8 different individual pieces, because you're cutting because you have to make something coherent out of this longer conversation from one person's perspective, whereas in a documentary, and then you're cutting that with clips and stills.
Right.
So you don't always have a lot of material. With Paramount, it's easy because I have the archive team. And if I
Hmm.
need something, they have it and they send it to me. But in the case of Shout, I've never sent anything with any of
Hmm.
these other labels. I have to go hunting for materials.
Oof.
And yeah. And so I don't always have a lot of coverage, I guess you could say. Whereas if it was an all in documentary, you cut from person to person,
Mhm.
clip, still, person, and then it's a lot easier to assemble by my
Sure.
perspective, just because you have so much more to use.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I always thought it was just like a revenue situation as to why that got cut back, but it also makes sense to have them pinpoint every single aspect that's in there, so it's more of a selling factor to
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. It looks bigger. And
Yeah.
I think that especially once I think Arrow kind of led the way on the special feature block on the back of the boxes, just
Hmm.
looking like an encyclopedia. I mean, there's always this massive text with an overwhelming looking amount of special features. And I think that kind of became du jour for everyone after
Hmm.
they started that shift, because then it starts to make everything else look real paltry if you just have one thing and then a trailer. Even though that thing may be an hour and a half long, it doesn't look as impressive at the outset. And you need to, as you said earlier, looking at those covers and that kind of impulse rent or impulse buy, if you have that big chunk of content on the back, you go, man,
Hmm.
I'm getting a lot for my money here.
And
So I understand that.
I would still love just to, even if you took excerpts from that interview and made a documentary and just had
Yeah.
one extra bullet point on there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've spoken enough on that,
Well,
but
I'm with you. I'm
yeah.
with you. I'm with you.
I'm kind of curious about the commentary side of things. I know you do a lot of recording for those as well.
Mhm.
Is there a different process as to people that want to be interviewed on camera as opposed to just like talking in front of a microphone?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are many people, especially if they may be older, who
Mhm.
might not be as confident or comfortable being on camera.
Sure.
And so what unless it's the plan from the outset, like on Gretel and Hansel, for example, the 4K that recently came out from
Hmm.
Shout, I was super excited to be part of that project. But I was also heartbroken when it originally was released because it has almost nothing on it. And I love Osgood Perkins and his cinema. And so I was like, man, what I really want on this is a commentary with him. And so I knew from the beginning, I didn't even need to talk to him about on camera. I just wanted that to be an audio commentary, and that worked out great.
Right.
There are other times when someone might say, oh, Justin, I would love to be a part of this. I just don't feel comfortable being on camera. And that happened with, oh, that hasn't been announced yet. That has happened a number of times where
Hmm.
they're just not real keen, or the schedule doesn't work out. Because the great thing about commentary too, and this shifted a bit with COVID, is that can be done remotely, where you don't have to necessarily book someone into a studio.
Right.
So let's say it's someone who's older and doesn't get around very well, or they're
Hmm.
immobile for whatever reason, or they're in Italy shooting a movie and they have 4 hours on this day, and I can't leave my hotel room.
Yeah.
Well, we can still get the stories. We can still capture this thing by connecting remotely and recording that way. So
Hmm.
I leave it up to the person, unless it's something I know really specifically I want to have that full discussion on. The one time when I didn't know that it was going to go that route was on King Kong 76 for Shout,
Hmm.
where I did an interview with Rick Baker, and who was very reluctant initially to do it, but he finally agreed with the coercion of his wife, and we started talking, and he just started going into this. I mean, I think I asked maybe 3 questions of him, and then he just went into this.
Yeah.
Yeah, the floodgates opened in him, and chronologically he told the entire tale from the very beginning of that project to the end, with only a couple breaks to ask me, am I covering everything okay or whatever.
Yeah.
And by the
Do
time
you?
it was,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's
Hmm.
Rick Baker, just keep
Correct.
talking, I'm in heaven here. And by the time it was done, I realized immediately that this needs to be an audio commentary.
Mm.
And it was a weird one because he's not speaking obviously to scene specific stuff on that track,
Hmm.
but there's no way they would let me put a 2-hour interview with Rick Baker on that
Right.
disc. The only way I was going to get away with it was as commentary. So I mixed it as such. And there were a
Nice.
couple little dead spots where I bring up the audio in the film,
Hmm.
bring it back down. But man, the stories he was sharing, many of them he was telling for the first time. And he kind of starts it off by saying, I want this to be my final statement on this, because it was a very controversial project for him and for Dino De Laurentiis.
Hmm.
The promotional side of that film was a real cluster. And so Rick's story was incredibly revealing, endlessly insightful and fascinating. And that's one that I knew right away had to be something more than what I had originally planned for it.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
It anybody listening to this live, if you want to ask questions to Justin, just like Justin asks questions to everybody that he interviews, feel free to. I'll get to them a little bit later. I'm kind of interested in the location commentaries, I guess, the remote access.
Mhm.
Do you ship them equipment for them to hook up, or do you just do it off of the laptop or a phone, or
It
how does that
depends.
work?
I've done both. So I do have a couple travel kits that I send people, which
Okay.
is real easy plug and play microphone. It's a Yeti Blue, I think is what they are.
That's what
And
I'm
so you
recording with
can,
right now. It's the simplest thing. Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
So imagine getting that if you're unskilled in computer tech or whatever, and you can
Right.
just plug it in, plug your headphone into the front, and
Hmm.
I send headphones with it too.
Yeah.
And then we get on and I do a test run and I walk them through how to do their settings on their phone. We'll be talking until we're able to connect through whatever.
Hmm.
And one of the great things that happened post COVID too, COVID during COVID, it was an incredible challenge to do this stuff remotely and keep the ball rolling.
Right.
There was no slowing down of the release schedule,
Hmm.
but all of a sudden, no one could be in the same room with each other on any front. And there were a couple of those. Eight-Legged Freaks was during that time. Haunt was during that time, and a few others where it simply had to be remote. At that time, we didn't really have any option other than Zoom.
Hmm.
There it is, Haunt. Yeah,
Yes.
and
Two guys from Iowa directed this movie. Of course, I
that's
have
right.
it. Yeah, guys from
Another
Grove.
Iowa connection. Yep.
Yep.
And well, that was one where Scott and I mean, one day I just messaged Scott and Brian, and I'm like, "What happened to Haunt?" And they're like, "The physical." I'm like, "Yeah." They're like, "It's so disappointing. It was only on like DVD in Walmart."
Hmm.
And it was pretty heartbreaking. And so we worked it all out together and pitched it around. And Ronin Flicks turned out
Hmm.
to be just like full of huge fans of the film. And we pitched them this insane list of ideas for features on that thing, old films of Scott and Brian's from when they were little and all this
Right.
stuff. And we thought that maybe even if we get 5% of this, we'll be happy. But
Hmm.
Ronan's like, go for it, do it all.
That's great.
And then they made it into this expansive box set. And Scott and Brian managed to get Tom and Andy, who did the score,
Hmm.
to authorize, and then by extension, the label to authorize and clear an exclusive soundtrack CD in that set. So there's a Haunt box set from Ronin that I think is still available that has the movie, tons of special features behind the scenes. Like I said, early films, commentaries, but then also it has the Tom and Annie score as a second disc in there, which is really cool.
Very
So
nice.
yeah. But that was one. So during that time, all we had was Zoom
Hmm.
during COVID. Zoom maxes out at 720 DP.
Right.
And so for those who aren't real plugged into that world, that essentially is videotape quality, is the best you can get out of Zoom.
Hmm.
Now we have things like Topaz AI and other upscaling programs that can help with that, but still it's not ideal. And then it just looked awful. Now, to your question about how to do the remote stuff,
Hmm.
both commentary and video interview, there's a platform called Riverside that's tremendous for this, because that can record up to 4K. And it records on, this is kind of into the weeds on the tech side, but it
That's
records
fine with me.
it records on both people's end to their computers. And as soon as it's kind of constantly uploading to a cloud. And then as soon as I hit stop record, it funnels all that down to me. So I have individual video and audio tracks for me and them, whoever else is involved.
Perfect.
And in higher resolution as their device will allow, which I try to have them use their phones and stuff. And it's incredible how good it works now. But back then it was a hell of a challenge with just Zoom, because Zoom is kind of, not the best.
The COVID days definitely helps technology kind of just advance with this type of stuff, like talking with people not in the same room, for sure.
And to your point earlier, it leveled the playing field in a way for people who aren't in LA. Because I frankly always had a bit of a chip on my shoulder because I wasn't out there full time. Because they don't need to hire a guy in Iowa for this stuff.
Right.
They never did, and they never will need to hire a guy in Iowa for this stuff. And so I always felt like I was I know I put a lot of pressure on myself all the time anyway. I'm certainly my harshest critic for sure, but especially during the early days prior to COVID, man, I really felt like I had to go 5 miles beyond the 10 that they were asking for to
Sure.
make sure that I was reiterating, like, no, just it's worth it to come this direction. It's not, maybe it won't be perfect. I'm still learning. I'm an eternal student,
Hmm.
but I always put that extra into it, and that'll never stop. But now the conversation when I meet someone doesn't begin with "You're from where?"
Hmm.
It's like, where are you at?" I'm like,
You can
"In
all be
Iowa."
anywhere. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, and they're all, "Oh, I've been to Iowa," or I went to University of Iowa and
I flew over
whatever.
Iowa is usually what
Well,
people.
there's that. Yeah, there's a lot of that, but it was
Right.
really great. I mean, for all the things that COVID did in a negative sense to the universe, one of the things it did was connect us all in a lot of new ways, and I'm
Right.
eternally grateful for that. Not just work wise, but just socially, friends, and universe wise too.
Hmm. Well, we've talked a lot about the work side of things of what you do. I kind of want to talk about the movie lover side of you as well, because
Hmm.
that's one of the reasons why you got into this business.
Yeah,
Are
yeah.
there any movies that really, what movies really got you into loving movies as a medium?
Uh, the Universal monster classics when I was little were huge, and Ed Wood films like Plan 9 from Outer Space, especially, was really
Hmm.
big with me. The Thing from Another World, War of the Worlds. There was a lot of sci-fi and horror stuff
I
early
was thinking,
on.
yeah, there's a fine line here.
Yeah,
I love like older sci-fi stuff.
yeah. I was open to everything, and I've often lamented the fact that when we were kids, we were wowed by everything. We didn't have the filters in place and the judgment sort of uh, like this thread of judgment about everything.
Hmm.
I didn't think critically about anything back then, and I look back on those days as being really magical because of that. Anything my parents would rent or I would rent, I would watch front to back.
Hmm.
I never watched a movie and thought this is terrible. I was just looking for. I just enjoyed the experience of taking it in.
During those Iowa winters, there's nothing else to do. You just
Legit.
whatever movies you rent or you have, that's your entertainment because you're not really leaving the house.
Yeah, and we didn't have much that we owned. The
Yeah.
first tape I ever bought was Dick Tracy's Dilemma on
Mhm.
VHS. Ralph Bird, still my favorite Dick Tracy movie, and then A Christmas Story. But outside of those and like a Johnny Carson tape set that my dad had,
I had that too.
it was the black tapes, right? The black case.
Mine was like a box set of like some of his best moments. It was a little
Yeah.
later, I think, but yeah. Mhm.
Okay. Well, so we just rented the hell out of everything in the area. Every grocery store rented, every drugstore. I mean, and we had memberships everywhere. And then we had this amazing place that was my mecca called Farmore. Do you
Hmm.
remember Farmore? Did you have that where you were in
I
Iowa?
don't believe so. No,
PHAR-MOR.
that
And they,
name sounds familiar, but it doesn't really ring a bell nostalgically to me.
I don't know how national they were, like how big they were, but they were kind of they were a precursor to the Walmart and the super Targets of today. So you could go in there and yes, they had a pharmacy, they had an automotive section, they had groceries, they had a bit of everything, but they
Hmm.
also had the most incredible video rental room.
Hmm.
And you got to they had the tapes in those squeeze shells. Do you remember those?
I have a couple. Yeah, I've got a decent sized VHS collection back there, and yeah,
Yeah.
I have a couple of the squeeze shells, and if you don't know how to get it out, it's like one of those like Chinese finger traps. You just like cannot figure this thing out
Yeah,
whatsoever.
that's true. That's true. But they're great for this reason that you mentioned earlier, a great point about going in and renting stuff based off the cover.
Oh yeah.
And that's really how I can say for myself that I discovered 90% of everything that I ever came to really love was just off that cover art.
Hmm.
And but the downside of that is you never got to go home with it. Most rental places send it home in an anonymous clamshell case or a
Yeah.
clear case with
Yeah.
just the spine and maybe a sticker or something.
Mhm.
At Farmore, they had the tapes inside the case. So when you
Mhm.
rented it, you took the tape with the cover art in that squeeze box home, unless, and they would cut them and modify them to fit in there if it was one of the clamshells or something.
Mhm.
But it was so thrilling to then have the tape sitting there, almost like when you would listen to a record or a CD. You have the case, you have the lyrics, and it was the same for me with movies, where I loved to have the tape sitting there, and I could reference it, read the synopsis on the back if it
Yep.
was really, I don't know, whatever. But that was a richer part of the experience. But the best thing about Farmore was that they had this thing, and I think it was 5 tapes, 5 days, $5.
There you go. Yeah. That's the
So we
dream right there.
we ride our bikes over there. We fill a bag with tapes and
Mhm.
maybe buy a couple of their 50-cent posters that they had rolled up with rubber bands in a bin by the door. And we'd have the weekend made off
Right.
of that. So that's really how I fell in love with so many other things. And it opened my eyes to everything. I mean, I remember renting Sleepaway Camp for the first time. I remember staying over at my buddy Jeff's house and watching Christine and Silver Bullet back to back and seeing
Mm,
both of those for the first time.
nice.
And then being terrified because his dad had skylights that he built into the house. And there are these trees clawing the skylights at night. And I mean, I just watched Silver Bullet. I'm not worried about a car coming through, but I am worried about a werewolf being up there.
Yep.
And that was a huge, a real striking memory for me. But I love that my parents didn't lock me in any box in terms of like, you only watch football or you only watch Westerns with
Sure.
dad or something like that.
Right.
They just let me go.
Yeah. With my kids, I'm the same way. And my parents really kind of just let me figure out who I was too. It's the best way to kind of learn things for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. For better or for worse. Yeah.
Hmm. I do kind of on like the video rental side of things. That's where my love of movies came from too. Just going to the video store, looking at everything surrounding me, and just picking things that kind of
Yeah.
tickled my fancy a little bit. For like this generation and further on, I don't know how like physical media is really going to connect with them because it's very niche right now as it is. A lot of people that collect it want to go back to the nostalgic days of going to a store, like that
Mhm.
recollection in their brain a lot. Where do you kind of see physical media going in the next 10 years with like newer generations getting into the medium?
That's a huge discussion, as you
That's,
can imagine.
yeah.
The whole streaming thing, because it happens so fast. And now we're seeing the repercussions of that in the
Hmm.
business,
Right.
where there was really no foundation established. There was no
Yeah.
precedent for best practices. Everybody just went in and went nuts.
And now companies are eating each other. Some streaming services are going to go away. It's just, yeah, Wild
Yeah,
West right now.
it is. It
Hmm.
is. But it's that moment in the Wild West where there's more law, right? There's more people sort of starting to come in and try to steer things in this direction or that. And it's prompted the creation of a lot of these free services that are riddled with ads like Tubi and these others.
Hmm.
And it's a very strange moment in that regard. There's nothing dependably out there on streaming. There's really no place where you can be guaranteed it's going to be there and stay there. Doesn't matter if you've purchased it or not. If they lose that license or something happens with whoever they're connected with for the rights,
Hmm.
you're at the mercy of these people on their side of things. And I don't think that's ever going to go away. Just like we find with music, just like we find with books. I mean, yeah, fewer people are buying physical books. A lot of people are listening to more audiobooks now or reading ebooks or whatever.
Hmm.
But there are many people who still want to hold them. And at the very least, they want to be able to save whatever they've purchased. And I don't think that's ever going to change with movies. Who thought even 10 years ago that vinyl would be the dominant music format in 2024?
It's still crazy.
It
Yeah.
is, but it
Hmm.
is. And where plants were shutting down over the last decade,
Yeah.
that did vinyl, now they're opening. Now there's
Hmm.
new ones and they aren't all great, but it's happening.
It's cool to see.
And
Yep.
it is. It is. And I think that that's born out of a return to interest in fidelity and interest in ownership.
Sure.
Because when you're streaming music, yeah, you can stream it. It's never going to sound as good as it does on a physical format, at least as of right now, unless
Mhm.
you have some super high class streaming platform that I'm not aware of. It may be out there, I'm not sure. But physical media itself, in terms of movies, I don't know if it's going to remain on discs forever. I've seen something about an even higher capacity disc that's
Mhm.
coming out soon that can do 8K, like up to 8K or something. And I don't know,
I
but
don't know. Yeah, I don't know if that's the way that this is gonna move at
yeah,
all.
I
I think
don't,
4K looks fine enough until even like I don't even know if people would buy 8K televisions. Like, it's hard enough to get people to buy the 4Ks. They're perfectly happy
Right.
with their 1080p's, and they're dirt cheap right now too. You can buy a giant like 65, 70 inch in Walmart for less than $500. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
Oh, that's all changed tremendously. And when you
Mhm.
look at, there are some services out there that monitor physical media sales. And
Mhm.
when you look at the trends in it, DVD is still the dominant format,
Yeah.
but far and away. Blu-ray is second, and 4K is kind of it comes and goes, it ebbs and flows, but it's a
Mhm.
definite distant third. So this takes us back to the days of VHS and Laserdisc, essentially, where VHS and Beta, right? There was the
Mhm.
wars between those two. VHS became the dominant platform generally because of cost, but the real cinemaphiles and the audiophiles were going to buy laser discs and stuff, and that was the
True.
precursor to Blu-ray, I mean to DVD, and then on to Blu-ray from there. So
Mhm.
I don't think, I don't know what the next medium is going to be, but I don't think people are ever going to not want to own their movies. And the other thing too is that streamers haven't mastered special features yet.
No, they're buried. They're hard to find. That's why I like I said, that's one of the main reasons why I like collecting physical media. It's right there. I don't have to look. I just have to press a couple buttons and it's there. On
Right.
all the streaming services, they're like hidden within like a tab of a tab. And it's just, yeah, it's very difficult to find half the time.
If they're there at all. I
Yes.
mean, many of them, I remember the first service I think I noticed it happening on was HBO. They seem to be kind of ahead of everybody in that realm, where they had some special features or at least extra content that they would have accompanying a piece or something for their, especially documentary content.
Hmm.
Now though, I've done stuff for streamers that have never been made available on physical.
Hmm.
And not only are these movies largely invisible, but the special features are completely invisible. I can't even tell you where to go to watch them because not every streaming service has them. They may be only on one and I
Yeah.
can't find it there. And that stuff I can say. I've done maybe 4 films that were direct to streaming. So newer movies that I did this stuff on.
Hmm.
And they're the only 4 films that I literally have never heard anything from anyone about in terms of the documentaries I did. And
Hmm.
for all of them, I did, as we were talking earlier, full-fledged, all-in documentaries with full cast and crew and stuff.
That's got to be frustrating.
It is, because I'm mostly frustrated for the people who were involved.
Hmm.
In the cases of at least 3 of those titles, it was a lot of young up-and-comers who were excited to be part of a feature, thrilled to be doing EPK interviews and stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they would love to be able to direct people to this, to show them, I was in this thing and here's me
Right.
talking about it.
Hmm.
But I just feel bad for them. And then for the collectors who, especially in the genre, we love to own our movies, and there's great stuff out there that no one knows is there because it's floating somewhere in this backwater off the main river
I
of
know.
streaming.
Like now, if I watch a streaming only movie and I want to get extra content on it, I either have to look on YouTube, see if there's anything there, or listen to a podcast, look that up, just get more audio that way. You
Yeah,
have to do more research on your end, which cuts out a big chunk of people.
it does. You brought up something really cool though. And I think this is happening in the world of fan films too. Like if you look at Friday the 13th, for example,
Mm-hmm.
people just got sick of waiting for another film.
Yeah.
And so they started making them.
Don't go in the woods, don't walk in the woods, something like that.
Yeah, yeah, the Womp Stomp stuff.
Yes.
That's just one example. I mean, this has been happening forever anyway. That's not been, I have so many great stories I want to tell about projects that haven't been announced.
Don't get in trouble here,
That are
please.
directly relevant. But
Yeah.
I was at a big director's house recently for a few days shooting special features for
Mhm.
a packed upcoming release that's going to be phenomenal. And they produced, we were talking about when we were kids, and I used to make home movies on video cameras that I rented from the grocery store
Yeah.
with my brother or my friends or whatever. And they were doing the same thing. And I'm like, man, I would love to see some of that.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking I could plug this into one of these special features. Like something could be done with this.
Absolutely. Yes.
And the next day when I got to their house, I walk in and they said, you're not going to believe this. And they pull up a tape and they hold it in front of me. And this ties into our story. It was their kid remake of a popular gangster movie.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say The Godfather for for
Sure.
lack of a better term.
Hmm.
And so they were making fan films back when they were little of this. So the fan film thing has been happening forever,
Oh yeah.
but now it's bigger than ever, and the means are there to shoot things that look and sound better than ever before on a smaller budget or no budget,
Hmm.
which is really exciting when the fans are just like, I love this so much. It's not even about, they know they can't monetize it. They know that it's going to be limited in scope in terms of getting it out there, but they
Hmm.
just want to contribute to that universe. And I really respect that. To your point, in the realm of special features, there's so many great podcasts out there that do commentary tracks.
Right.
And they're not just friends necessarily. I mean, many of the great ones, but friends just talking over the movie and enjoying
Hmm.
whatever, throwing out some trivia they researched. But then many times they'll bring in the director or the star or somebody from the film. And so, yeah, it's not attached to a release, but it's usually on films that don't have a physical release with that as a special feature anyway. And I
Yeah.
love that it's that same scenario, like what we talked about with the Friday the 13th, where it's like, if I'm not going to get this grand release, I'm going to try to offer the fellow fans as much of that experience as I can, even though it's my podcast or something. And I think that's so cool.
Sure. And I also love going to get more of like the director's filmography. Doesn't matter if it's official or stuff that they made when they were a kid.
Oh yeah.
Just seeing more from, like, I just bought the Shutter 4K of The Sadness, and some of the special features on there were that director's short films he made like a decade prior. And it's just, it's cool to see that stuff. It's also nice when it's loggable on Letterboxd, just so I get an extra thing to log it. But it just makes it fulfilling, because there's a little cartoon that plays in The Sadness, and I'm like, where is that from? It's actually that director's short film, like the first one that he ever made. So it's just getting backstory again for movies that you enjoy. It's the best. And I would have no idea that he made that cartoon if it wasn't a special feature on the release.
Yeah. And well, that's insight into their process.
Mm-hmm.
It also helps sort of validify filmmakers. That happened on Silent Night, Deadly Night 2 with me, where the director Lee Harry, Silent Night, Deadly Night 2. Are you familiar with that one?
I am. Yes.
Okay. So it's really been drugged through the mud over the years as being just a rehash of the first one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I learned very quickly in my early discussions with Lee Harry, the director, that he was assigned the mission initially to just recut the original movie, remove the violence, and let's release it as a holiday film.
Oh, geez.
That was the mission. That's so impossible.
That's not directing anything. Yeah.
It's not. And he was an editor anyway. So they were asking the editor, like, just recut this. We want to make a little bit of money if we can and not have as much blood or whatever. But Lee said, what if you give me a couple $1,000s and a couple days to shoot things, and we make a new movie, and we can include that some footage from the original, but let's give him something new. And they said, okay. And so then Lee, in a very short window of time, put an incredible amount of work and effort into this. He went and did photo storyboards in locations that he scouted. This is a movie where he only had like just a week or so to shoot all this stuff. He has a total wraparound, not even a wraparound, but a thread throughout the whole film with Eric Freeman as the brother of the killer in the first one. And it has a big car explosion stunt. It's got practical special effects, exploding eyes, and other gore gags. It's got a rain tower in one scene that they bring into play with the umbrella sequence. It's so, the audacity that he approached this movie with is so incredible. And I thought, how unfair that he's been maligned all these years by people who just don't know the story, because the real story of it had never been told prior to us doing that disc. And when I was interviewing him, he was telling stories like you and I just talked about, where when he was a kid, he would shoot movies with his friends and his brother in the backyard, and even down to some specific details about stop motion. I had this rock that was chasing me around in my house, and there's I would shoot my friend with an arrow and blood would spurt out or whatever. It was so cool. And it was clear that he had been a filmmaker from day one. This guy who's been unfairly maligned for so long on this movie. And after everything was said and done, and I'm sitting with my editor, Mike, and we were talking through it, and I'm like, man, I wish we had that footage. And so I messaged Lee and asked him, I'm like, does any of that exist? And he didn't think it did. He said he'd check. And then, I don't know, 4 hours later, I get a text, and he said, I found it in a box in the attic.
That's crazy.
And because he's an editor, he's still an editor to this day. He's one of the biggest trailer cutters in Hollywood. He's like, let me digitize this and see what's there. And then bing, bing, big emails start showing up with these little clips, and it's exactly what he was talking about. It matches his storytelling exactly. So the way that documentary now starts, and this was my mission to sort of validify Lee Harry, the filmmaker. It starts with the sound of an 8mm projector playing and the footage of him in the backyard, like of his brother getting shot and whatever happening. And then his voice. I always loved film. I've always been a filmmaker. When I was a kid, and then he starts telling these stories, and then I have this wonderful vintage footage to lay over the top of it.
That's
and
great.
it was such an amazing discovery.
Yeah.
Where we find that you're talking about the value of special features and stuff. I mean, it can really help cement a legacy.
Yeah.
Not to put too much weight on it, but in a lot of cases, it's a real process of discovery, not just for audiences, but for the people who were part of something that they may have not even loved, or maybe they had written off because they bought into negative hype about it or whatever. I mean, it brings people back to a moment. And especially if it's an early film, it can be a really changing experience for them that it's super exciting to be a part of.
I was going to say, it's not even part of the people watching this footage. It's literally of the person that it's affecting, that is digging through old stuff and watching stuff that they have not seen in like 20, 30 years. What a cool feeling.
Yeah. It's amazing to be a part of that, even a little sliver of that,
Absolutely. Well, you've talked a little bit about like you love kind of crafting a nice narrative from like, documentary style footage. What documentaries have you seen that have really inspired your work?
Early on, it was the Full Moon Video Zone segments. Do you remember if you ever rented a Full Moon tape back in the day, after you watched the movie, and he had no reason to do it, Charlie. He had no reason to do this. He included a making of segment on that film that would also then visit the sets of one or two other productions that he had going on. So you'd have like a half an hour, 45-minute bit that was always usually introduced by Charlie. And then you got to see the making of the movie that you just saw. Sorry
to interrupt.
No.
I just core memory unlocked here. I do remember getting some of those VHS tapes. I was still pretty dang young when I was going to the movie store. I got movies like Prehysteria and Remote, and they had that stuff at the very end of it too. Kind of that's one of the reasons why I'm like, oh, this is how movies are made. And I was just fascinated with that.
Was that probably the first time you ever saw that?
Absolutely. Because this is before the internet. You just didn't have access to this type of stuff. So actually seeing it, because again, there's nothing to do at your house when it's cold outside, it's negative degrees. You're just watching the movie. You even have it playing on the background. I always kept mine going just so it would rewind after it was done. And then when you hear something else pop up, like, what is that?
Yep.
Just magical stuff, man.
Yeah, there was so much. There was a lot of preservation happening around classic films. But there wasn't a whole lot of preservation and love being given to the stuff that I quickly learned I loved, which was B movies, C movies, and sci-fi and horror and stuff like that. Charlie Band, in my mind, by my at least early experience, was the first one to offer that when he had no need to do so at a time when it was not in vogue. And it opened a lot of perspective for me into the process. And I think that resonates to this day, because he often would focus on the special effects makeup teams. There'd be bits of interviews with a lot of people from the productions, but man, was it exciting to see them making a dinosaur for some Z-grade movie, or how the puppets in Puppet Master worked. Things like that is so much more fascinating than like, what did, I don't know, Tom Hanks wear in Forrest Gump? Why did he wear that tie or whatever? Like, okay, that's kind of interesting, but show me how this monster moves, because I don't get it. I just saw the movie. Now I want to know how. Anyway, that was the really early exposure for me. The one that blew the doors off my perception, to kind of awkwardly quote Huxley in The Doors, is Dangerous Days, which is the making of Blade Runner.
Oh,
that film it remains my all-time favorite documentary on filmmaking. It's exhaustive. It's longer than the movie itself.
Yeah.
It is so expertly handled and assembled. The interviews are so thorough, and you can tell that they weren't just asking sort of rote questions of everyone. They were
Mhm.
getting into the real minutia of what made this completely iconic film, this amazing thing that it is, blended with an incredible volume of behind the scenes footage and photos.
Yeah.
So, Dangerous Days is, I recommend to everyone, see that, even if you're not a huge fan of Blade Runner. That is a lesson in filmmaking, in getting through tough production challenges, and in dealing with a real gallery of personalities that are pouring into this a massive production. Oh, it's so great.
There's two I want to shoot your way just to see
Yeah.
if you've seen them. First one, The Hamster Effect, the making of 12 Monkeys. It's on the
Oh
Arrow video
no.
release. Amazing. Like, not only does it go through the making of process, it goes through the editing, it goes through like the press junket that Terry Gilliam went on. It just
Cool.
kind of encapsulates everything that he was doing in that specific time frame. It's one of
Oh
the best
man.
making ofs I've ever seen. But I think the best one personally I've seen, and I was trying to look up what it was named because I know it's on Letterbox loggable. It's the making of the Social Network. It's on the Blu-ray that releases on.
Someone else brought that up recently too,
It's
and they
so
recommended I see that.
it's so thorough. It's the editing on it is so sharp and quick. It If you're a fan of that movie or just the art of filmmaking, I think it's a must watch for everybody.
That's so cool. Isn't that great when it can lend, it gives you, on these really good ones,
Mm,
they offer so much more than just the making of a film. I love when the director, whoever's creating it, goes at it from a wider perspective
hmm
and gets into the weeds a little bit in these different departments and things, because so many of those classic making of or EPK things are primarily focused on actors, and actors are great, but I've always been more into the technicians that are on set, the special effects, production design,
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. And for a lot of reasons. And now I found that they're the ones who are literally there every day, where actors aren't.
hmm
And so they have a real rich perspective on what happened, but also they're close to everything. And they're usually working with other departments and having to dovetail their efforts. And so their stories tend to be more fascinating. I love when a documentary about the making of a movie opens up doors on a perspective to filmmaking as a whole,
Yes.
or maybe even
The,
challenges a perception of something like, wow, I
the
had no idea.
process of a filmmaker's vision going through as many checklists as they need to go through.
Right.
For The Hamster Effect, it talks about like getting it seen in front of test audiences and
Mm.
hating the original ending, and Gilliam fighting to keep it and talking with studio heads about this new ending that we filmed is terrible and I do not want it, and he would walk away from the project. Like, it's full of drama. Like, I love 12 Monkeys.
Ugh.
I think I love the documentary just as much.
Oh, that's amazing. That's how I feel about Dangerous Days too. I love
Mhm.
it. I watch it more now than Blade Runner because I've seen Blade Runner so many times in life that
Sure.
Dangerous Days has become the same comfort food that Blade Runner was for me for many years, just to have on in the background. I know
Mhm.
the beats, I can listen to it without even looking at the screen. I know what's coming up and all that. And I love it. And whenever I'm needing to be refreshed, whenever, that's one that I put in for sure. That and any commentary with Carpenter and Kurt Russell,
Hmm.
that's another reminder of how good things can be and how
Mhm.
fun things can be.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the podcast, but all it literally does is rip audio commentaries that so you can listen to them on the
Oh,
go. It's
wow.
the best. That's how I listen to mine. I have a long commute to work, so
Yeah.
it just helps kind of pass the time. And a lot of the commentaries, even if you don't see what it's actually talking about, if you
Mhm.
know the film well enough, you can still like see it in your mind while there's no image in front of you.
Yeah, yeah, and I used to record movies, just the audio from a film onto tape,
Hmm.
and then listen to those as I was going wherever,
Oh,
to
sure. Hmm.
school, to ride my bike or whatever, and it was the same thing. I used to build soundtracks too. I still have some of those tapes where I'd record that during the intro and hit pause, and
Mm,
then when more music came up, unpause, and 'cause I'm like a real soundtrack nut, score
yeah.
nut, and that was the only way to get a lot of that stuff,
Yeah.
especially in the early days. But I still have a CD of Plan 9 from Outer Space.
Hmm.
That's just the audio from the whole film. It comfortably sits on one disc,
Hmm.
and I love listening to that. Pure comfort food for me.
I worked in a movie theater in college. In college, I just had like a checklist of jobs I wanted that are just like, okay, I'm going to work at a video store. I'm going to work at a movie theater. That was one of
Cool.
them. And one of my jobs at the movie theater was to put the trailers on. Like, this was film reels, like one of the last theaters that I know of that had this stuff.
Mhm.
I cut the trailers onto the film itself. So I got to make sure like what order the trailers went on.
Oh, cool.
And according to whatever movie it was, I really wanted to kind of like, if they're there to watch the trailer, at least have it like correlated to what the movie is about.
Right.
And I still have like the reel of the trailer for The Social Network because I think it's one of the best trailers ever caught. It's the best.
You got to hold on to that stuff too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, we're not very good about keeping track of these things from these moments that mean so much, and they move through so quickly in our lives that I think it's vital that we hold on to that stuff.
That's the older really cool you get, the more you think about that stuff.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's see. A lot of the comments that we've had in here is more like Justin's the best. He's a legend, that type of stuff.
Thank you.
A lot of hellos. A couple questions that we got in here. Love Event Horizon. The Halloween commentaries were a couple of Greg's favorites. Happy Optimist always pops in and asks for your 4 favorite films, kind of like what Letterboxd does. I know you talked about some of your favorites growing up. Do you have like a core set of movies that you always go back to?
Oh, Jaws is one.
Sure. That's a good one.
Okay, I'm just going to say what first comes to mind. This isn't necessarily the top 4, but the first movies that pop into my mind are Jaws, Blood Hook, Grizzly, and what, that was 3, right? That I gave you. I'll say Halloween 78.
Sure.
But this list is ever changing. So I've never been good at top, however, of anything because it's a real cycle. And I'm a seasonal watcher. So in the summertime, I'm all about summertime and outdoor films and things. In the winter, accordingly, all winter movies and The Shining over and over. Oh, The Shining would be in my top 5. Yeah, that would be up there. So I don't know. A bad answer. I'm never a good answer on that one.
There's never a bad answer when it comes to this. I always see myself watching seasonal stuff from like October to December, but other than that, I'm kind of all over the board. But Halloween, it's got to be the spooky stuff, or at least like get in the mood of like fall movies, and then Christmas, of course. Just any reason for me to feel nostalgia about that time frame as a kid, I will always just jump on board to, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh man, I think there was one more question in here. Is there a movie that gives you much needed serotonin boosts?
Yeah, the one like Turbo Kid. Have you seen Turbo Kid?
Yes, I have. It's been a while, but yeah.
Oh my God. I love that movie. That movie is just a straight, if I were to guess what doing heroin is like, but like happy heroin, it would be Turbo Kid. It's a direct main line of just joy for me. That movie is bliss and happiness and color and gore and all this great stuff.
I think mine kind of in that vein was Psycho Gore, man. Like as soon as I saw that, I'm like, this movie was made just for me. Like, well, I never knew I needed this combination of things in my life, but I love every second of it.
Yeah, absolutely Turbo Kid, and I rely a lot on this stuff. You know, there's many times when I need that kind of serotonin boost, as he said. But Jaws is another one that is one that yes, I watch during the summer, but I can watch that one anytime, and it really brings me a lot of joy. But the Strange Brew, which I think I mentioned briefly earlier, that's another one that I can watch anytime, and it cheers me up, makes me happy. So that would be my short list. And then beyond that would be Greasy Strangler, Revenge of the Nerds 1 and 2. A long list of weirdness that would follow.
Nothing wrong with that. I think every kid that grew up in like the video store era always has like that side tangent of weirdness to them, especially if they just like loved going there as much as a lot of us did. So
yeah. When you're not renting on genre, you're renting on cover art or something.
Correct.
It leads you down a lot of fun side roads for sure. And that's a great education that's unfiltered.
I was always the kid that was nervous to go into the horror section because I was a scaredy cat. I still remember the first horror movie I rented for my 13th birthday. It was a Maximum Overdrive because that cover art was just screamed, I need to see this. And I thought it was terrifying as a kid. I think it's hilarious now, but it's,
I remember watching that for the first time. It was the summertime and we rented it. And I was sitting I remember where I was sitting and watching it. And I don't remember the whole movie, but what I do remember is all of that early stuff with the bridge and the cars falling off of it,
Oh, sure.
and the pop machine that's shooting
Yep,
sodas at that
yep.
kid's
The
face, and
lawnmower,
the
yeah.
lawnmower and all that.
Yeah.
As a kid, that was terrifying to me. And I think I saw that and then Cujo in the same night. So I
Mm.
watched Maximum Overdrive during the day and then Cujo that night with my brother. And it's still the only time I've ever watched Cujo.
Cujo would scar me if I saw it as a kid, for sure. Because I
It,
love dogs, and I don't think if I watched that, I don't think I would.
it was it was like there's two memories that I have of seeing movies when I was a kid that I just wore like a damp fur coat afterwards. The first was Texas Chainsaw Massacre at my buddy Jason's house.
Hmm.
He had told me the story of that movie while we were on the playground one day at school during recess, that he saw this movie that his dad had just rented, and he described it, and it was I had only seen like Frankenstein, Creature from the Black Lagoon and stuff at this point. I had
Hmm.
no concept of a man with a chainsaw or putting someone on a meat hook or whatever, and I was mortified just from him telling me about it. And
Yeah.
then a few weeks later I went to his house and he's like, "Do you want to watch it?" And his dad was one of these guys who had a library of tapes that he had pirated. So he'd go and rent them, duplicate it, put it in one of those fake leather looking clamshells with the little slip card on the side.
Hmm.
And and I think it just said chainsaw on it. And it was like this terrifying thing in the room, like someone had released a cobra and we knew it was there.
Hmm.
And this kid wants me to suddenly play with this cobra. And then he put it in and watched it. And I remember the color of the carpet in the room that day, the sun beating down through the window, the everything about it, because I just sat there frozen for its duration and had nightmares about it for days afterwards. That
I
absolutely mortified me.
I think I was 14-ish, somewhere in that range. And I would always go to my friend's house. That's where I would watch things that I was not able to watch at my
Yeah.
house, because
Yeah. Yeah.
we couldn't even watch The Simpsons in my house. Like, they were very
Oh,
strict on that type of stuff. I know, but I watched Saw over at my friend's house. Like, it
oh,
just came out on. I think that we just watched the VHS, and
yeah.
that was one of those movies where I'm like, I did not think I liked horror movies, but I am captivated with this. And then the ending just blew everybody's mind when he got up, game over,
Yeah.
slammed the door. It's special experiences like that I'll never forget.
Oh, yeah. And we have to hold on to those memories. And I think it's through recounting them in conversations like this that we
Hmm.
can help tether them in there in a more permanent way, because there's so much stuff that's like, oh yeah, that memory. And we need to hold on to those things. I think it's really important that we do, because it also reminds us as we do what we do of why we do it.
Hmm.
It's easy for it to become monotony or to become work, and you don't want it to become work. You want it to be driven by passion and by the love for what drew you there in the first place. And
Right.
if you lose track of the reasons why and the roads that led you there, I think you can go astray easily.
Well, kind of going with that, this will be like one of the last questions. When we are talking about nostalgia and just like grasping onto that stuff, you've worked on releases for movies from the Halloween franchise, Friday the 13th franchise, a lot of like cult franchises that people have a lot of great memories for.
Mhm.
How does that make you feel? Like, do you feel like a sense of ownership over these movies? Do you feel like I need to go above and beyond what I'm making for this franchise because it's so held up high for so many people?
It's really special. Getting involved with the Halloween stuff, like I told you early on in this conversation, was just
Hmm.
mind blowing. It's still mind blowing that I was ever a part of that. That was really, really the hugest honor, because Halloween was always my favorite franchise out of all of them.
Yeah.
And I didn't get to do a lot in that franchise, though. I ended up doing those commentaries on 4 and 5. And then years later, Shout brought me in to do the special features on Resurrection when they did the
Hmm.
4K of 6, 7, 8.
Yeah.
And I put a lot into that because I was so excited to finally have, yeah, there it is in that
Hmm.
box. Yeah.
Right.
And I poured a lot into that because it not only, it's not necessarily my favorite in the series, Resurrection. I know
Hmm.
it's an early entry for a lot of people who put their toe in the water at that time. I've met a number of folks over the years that was their introduction to sometimes horror as a whole or to Halloween. And so I respect that. Everybody enters the stream at some point. And also my friend, Steph Hutchinson, had done all the Halloween comics, and
Oh.
those began around the time of Resurrection. And so I thought, and Steph is someone who I think his story has kind of been lost in the mix over the years in the Halloween universe, which is incredibly complex and dramatic.
Right.
But I wanted his voice to be heard. And so even though he's not a part of Resurrection, technically, the first thing I went after on that one was a piece on Steph and the story of these comics, because he's really written more than just about any other single person in the Halloween universe when you put all of his comics together. So it was a real honor to, even if I would have only been able to do that one feature, I would have been very happy with having gotten that story out there. But in terms of pressure, I don't really feel that. On the Friday the 13th, I was brought in the 11th hour. There was, I don't remember the situation at the time, but they basically came to me and were like, okay, what can you give us? Like, can you come up with stuff and how fast?
Because they were just needing extra content to kind of boost
the
pinpoints or whatever.
Yeah. And I don't know what had happened, if something fell short somewhere in the line. I really don't know, but they didn't put any kind of parameters on it. And so I know Alice Cooper. And so I pitched, and Jason Lives is one of my favorite Fridays. And so I'm like, man, the story behind that music video for He's Back, which in the franchise, I think is still the only sequel that has its own regular run music video like that. That was a real mainstream success. And I was always captivated by that element of that film and that video. And so I interviewed Alice for it. And then I found Jeffrey Abelson, who was the director of the video, who I found out was a pioneer in music videos as a whole. He did stuff with like Billy Joel and I think Michael Jackson and Madonna early on. I mean, he kind of helped invent that genre. And that was a fascinating conversation. Yeah. So even though I was brought, and then I did Tom McLaughlin on that too, in kind of a crazy interview, the director of Jason Lives, where he wanted to be interviewed in the mausoleum at Forever Hollywood Cemetery, where he's going to be interred when he dies, because he's already purchased his plot there.
Wow.
And he's like, I'll do it if you guys can shoot me in front of my plot.
Oh, that's great.
And so we literally sat him up in front of his placard that doesn't have any, it just has his birth year on there. Yeah. Of course, knock on wood, not anytime soon that we'd have the other. And then did the interview there. And then at the end, when I was cutting it, he had asked me, he had said, at the end of this, can you have me walking away and disappearing in the mausoleum? And so actually it was prior to me cutting it, because we had to shoot this sequence of him, like we reset and then have him getting up, walking around the corner and walking away down the hallway, just so I can make him sort of dissolve as that happens, because he wanted to have this be his kind of on the record farewell in the place where he's going to spend eternity.
Sure.
Because he's like, I would love for fans to come here if they want to come and sit and talk to me or whatever. It sounds so unusual, but it was so genuine and heartfelt.
He had a vision. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And all that came together in the course of like a week, being able to assemble, like schedule, shoot, and assemble all that stuff, because they needed it very quickly. And I don't think any of my features are even listed on the packaging. They're only in the menus on that special. There's like a separate disc in there for just special features.
There is, yeah.
And that's where it all resides, but it's kind of hiding in the backwaters there, where you have to dig for it a little bit. But man, is it worth it to see the remastered He's Back video and the stories behind it, and then this great interview with Tom. So
at least that's easier to find than somewhere on a streaming service, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Or an Easter egg somewhere, like where they used to hide things.
I spent so many hours trying to find that stuff. Yeah. That's a whole other conversation, man. Yeah. I love digging for that stuff.
Oh yeah, it's fun. It's fun.
Well, speaking of fun, this conversation has been a blast. I appreciate you coming on here.
Yeah,
is there anything that you'd like to plug before we kind of get out of here?
I mean, just support your physical media labels. I get out there and, Umbrella, Eureka, Shout Factory, Vinegar Syndrome, TerraVision, all of them. I mean, this stuff, it really is more than just giving you films for your collection. It's film preservation in an era when things disappear and come and go so fleetingly. And more, the new entertainment that we're getting isn't going to be available that way, or at least currently isn't. And so if you want to hold on to this stuff, you're preserving history, especially with unedited forms of all these films that often end up on streaming in cut versions or whatever.
Right.
So that's right. My first message is that. The second, if you just want to find me, I'm on just social media with my name, BEAHM or Reverend Entertainment. I have the podcast that I have going again now, the Radio Hour, and that's on all the different platforms. And that includes new interviews as well as some archival stuff. Like a couple episodes ago was a huge career spanning discussion with Crispin Glover, for example.
I was going to mention that one. I listened to that just in preparation for this, and yes, that was an amazing conversation.
Oh, he was so fascinating. But so yeah, I mean, I'm in all those different places, and if anybody ever has any questions, suggestions, feedback, or whatever, you can hit me up. Oh, my website is justinbeahm.com, and there's a contact form on there where you can reach out to me if you want to as well. So yeah, and thank you so much for having me on. This has been awesome.
No, the pleasure is all mine. This has been an amazing conversation. It lived up to my personal hype. So thank you again. Yeah. This has been episode number 35 of Boutique Talk. And until next time, I'll see you.